Okay, just for the information of those who came in late, I called the official roll sheet. You will need to come up and see me after class because I marked you absent. So last week, through a Spaniard, Francisco Goya, as well as through a Frenchman, Honoré Daumier, we were introduced to the concept of realism, specifically concentrating on painting. And I want to continue to talk about realism in French art in the 19th century, and we're going to be looking first at Gustave Courbet, whom, if you could think of any Frenchman who represents realism in the 19th century, it would be Courbet. And when we finish looking at Courbet, I want to look at traditions of Romanticism, which continue to be of primary importance in much of the rest of Europe in the first half of the 19th century. So we'll talk about German Romanticism, and then we'll talk about English Romanticism, keeping in mind that Romanticism is a tradition which we have previously defined in terms of the early 19th century. But now Courbet. Courbet was born in northeastern France, in a city called Ornans, O-R-N-A-N-S. It was a good-sized city, but in fact his father was a wealthy farmer, so he was raised out, so to speak, on the land. He was not interested, however, in continuing his father's line of work, and although his parents might have liked him to become a professional, he told them very early on that he wanted to become a painter. He was born in 1819. By 1831, he started attending art school in his hometown of Ornans. And his teacher, in fact, was a former pupil of Gros, G-R-O-S, one of the great romantics whom we talked about previously. But often it takes one approach to cause a student to actually kind of move in a completely different direction. Eventually, in 1839, Courbet went to Paris, where he attended private atelier classes on and off for about 5 years. He was not interested in applying to or attending the École des Beaux-Arts. Now remember, this is still early on in the 19th century. It's about 1839, 1840. The first painting that he ever showed in the salon, through the salon jury, is the one I show you on the left-hand side, the self-portrait with black dog, painted in 1842 and exhibited in the salon in 1843. One of the things that I need you to know about Courbet right away, because he's going to be beaten down severely by the critics, as you'll see, is that this man had an enormous ego. He had a tremendous amount of confidence to the point of arrogance. And really, this is what I think allowed him to survive in what was a very difficult period for artists who were moving away from ideals of academic classicism or even Romanticism in the 19th century. It is also said that he always preferred one profile to the other. So we see him, and by the way, we're going to begin to see photographs of artists more and more, and photographs of the time period, because photography is invented by 1839, really a little bit earlier than that, but 1839 is the usual date that's given. So this is a photograph of Courbet, the mature Courbet, in around 1860 by the French photographer Félix Nadar, and we will be talking about Nadar eventually. And he did prefer to be seen from this side of his face. He thought he was the most handsome from this point of view. When his work was accepted to the Salon, Courbet was really extremely happy because the Salon was still, in the 1840s, the only way that an artist could legitimately begin to make a reputation and gain acceptance in the art world in France. He actually wrote a letter home in 1843, stating how overjoyed he was to have one painting accepted into the Salon, despite the fact that numerous others which he had submitted had been rejected. His enthusiasm illustrates the continuing, one might say, stranglehold with which the establishment was able to control instruction, control style, control subject matter. Courbet wrote to his family, "At last, I have been accepted at the exhibition, which gives me the greatest pleasure. The accepted picture is not the one I would have most liked to show, but that doesn't matter. They have done me the honor of giving me a very good place in the show, which is some compensation." That must mean he didn't get skied right up at the very top of the wall. Keep in mind that Courbet is living in France, and of course, specifically in Paris, by 1839, during the same politically explosive period, or periods that we have talked about already in relation to Honoré Daumier, who is a contemporary, basically. Like Daumier, Courbet was a Republican, that's a lowercase Republican, and a champion of working class rights. He was very happy about the overthrow of Louis Philippe's government in 1848 and the establishment of a second French Republic. In essence, the rhetoric of realism is going to begin to be heard and reacted against, not only in France in this period, but in much of the literature and art and politics of much of Western Europe. Courbet may never have read Karl Marx's Manifesto of the Communist Party, which was published in 1848, and I show you the first edition manifesto. You can see the date there. But Courbet's art shares some of the ideas that were widespread in Europe by the middle of the century. The desire for social change, which would include a transformation from the predominance of the aristocracy to the greater and greater importance and relevance of the worker class, of the lower classes. This will also see a transformation in terms of subject matter, not only in terms of what is appropriate subject matter for painting, for instance, but it's also going to see a greater interest in moving away from what had been a predominant subject matter for so many centuries in Western Europe, the subject matter which was dominated by the patronage of the church. And I'm talking about sacred subject matter. Keep in mind that many of the artists that we've talked about thus far in this class, the French artists, and Goya as well, were very much involved while they were creating portraits, yes, of their wealthy patrons, were also being commissioned by governments to create works for churches, for City Hall, works that specifically had a sacred meaning or connotation, whether that was biblical or the stories of the saints associated with any particular city or place. So we begin to see a movement away from painting the sacred to painting the profane. Profane, P-R-O-F-A-N-E. Someone needs to Google that word for us. Profane. Who's going to do it? Got a couple of people? Give us a definition of profane. Who have I got working on it so we're not all sitting here going, oh, go ahead.
Relating or devoted to that which is not sacred or biblical, secular.
Secular, all right. And we've used that term secular before. Thank you. One more time. Do you still have it up?
Yeah, hold on. relating or devoting to that which is not sacred or biblical, secular.
Okay, thank you. Courbet's pronouncements about art are very revealing, particularly in terms of, I'm going to go back to his image here, particularly in terms of the realist movement in France. Courbet is extremely famous, and in fact, he was infamous for his statement, "Show me an angel, and I will paint one." Okay, that's a realist. How can you paint an angel if you've never seen one? Okay? He also said, "I hold that artists of one century are completely incapable of reproducing the things of a preceding or future century." So he's reflecting on Daumier's idea, il faut être de son temps. You need to be of your own time. Painting the Oath of the Horatii, painting works from the Bible is not relevant to the modern world, to the modern painter. Interestingly enough, because of the repercussions of the Revolution of 1848, the Salon, the official arm of the French Academy, was open to everyone in 1848. There was no jury. All right, this was an attempt to democratize the Salon, to give everyone a chance. As a result, Courbet exhibited 10 works in the Salon in 1848. And the following year, this what was considered to be excessive democracy by those who reconsolidated power was reversed. But in one of the efforts to liberalize the Salon that occurred sporadically throughout the century, the new government ruled that the jury should be composed of painters chosen by election rather than appointed by the academy or the academic hierarchy. So, in other words, we're starting to see perhaps a kind of loosening of the grip of the academic masters on who is on the jury. Are we going to become more liberalized? Well, we'll see. In any case, Courbet exhibited 11 works in 1849. And this more liberal jury awarded Courbet a second-class medal for this painting called After Dinner at Ornans. So what is Ornans? His hometown. Yes, his hometown. After Dinner at Ornans, exhibited at the Salon of 1849. This is a good size work. It's over 8 feet 5 inches in width, 6 feet 5 inches in height. So those figures are slightly over life size because they're basically sitting down. This work is the first of Courbet's major works that has been called realist, that this is a realist painting. It is a picture of ordinary people, people from Ornans, as we understand from the title, who are sitting around a table, it looks like after dinner, in a very simple interior that's basically or barely defined for us. The irony here for the painting After Dinner at Ornans was that under Salon regulations, any painter who had won a medal, and remember, Courbet just won a second-class medal at the Salon of 1849 for this painting. Any painter who had won a medal in a previous Salon could exhibit any work in the future without submitting it to the jury. Subsequent Salon juries, feeling a horrible mistake had been done in giving Courbet a second-class medal for this work, would attack him vociferously from now on. Eugène Delacroix, who, of course, was still very active at this period of time and having his own issues as a romantic, recognized the rather revolutionary character of Courbet's After Dinner at Ornans, and he called it innovative and without precedent. Now, what is interesting about this work is not so much that Delacroix says it's without precedent, because there were plenty of precedents for showing ordinary people in an interior at a table having finished eating, and in fact enjoying smoking and some music. As you can see, that's what's going on here. In fact, what you're seeing here is a kind of variation on what we would find in Dutch Baroque painting, genre paintings, small paintings that show scenes of everyday life. There was an interest in France at this time in Dutch genre paintings, Genre, scenes of everyday life. But if you remember, if you took the History of Art 1B, for instance, you remember that Dutch paintings tended to be painted for private patrons for their houses, yes? And these paintings tended to be small, rather intimate-sized paintings, not large paintings. So a number of critics found fault with the work because they said Courbet has created an oversized genre painting, a criticism that was repeated about subsequent works. And the major criticism is, who the hell does he think these people are? These people are not important enough to be painted on the scale of a history painting. Are you with me here? You seeing the logic or the illogic in this? The painting represents a group of Courbet's family and friends. His father, probably all the way to the left, who almost looks as though he's falling asleep. And then Courbet, whom you should recognize in his profile here, leaning on his hand. They're listening to the fiddler on the far right. The subject seemed very strange to a number of critics because they said, you know, that the value of great painting is that it teaches us something. There is a kind of moral or ethical narrative. There is dramatic focus or intent. And we simply don't see any of that here. In fact, you tell me, what do you see as the focal point? The point, what would be the most important part of the painting, where your eye sort of naturally goes? Where is it? It could be based on because there's color or hierarchy in terms of value contrast. Where are you looking? Okay, you're looking at someone who has his back turned to us, right? In a chair that has its back, and not only that, and this is the, you know, the sort of the highlight. I mean, you could be looking at the tablecloth, I suppose, and then your eye goes down, and you're looking at a great big old dog on the floor. This is going to come up again in a Courbet, by the way. So, the theme of figures seated around a table was very common, as I was just mentioning, in 17th century Dutch and Flemish genre paintings. And in fact, Courbet had a particular interest in none other than the Dutch painter Rembrandt van Rijn. And in fact, Courbet had been to Holland sometime between 1846 and 1847 and would have had an opportunity to see a number of Rembrandt paintings. Paintings that tend to have a strong sense of drama, strong manipulation of light and dark, and a kind of realism that would very much have appealed to Courbet. In fact, he didn't have to go to Holland to see Rembrandt. He could have seen a number of Rembrandt paintings in Paris. I show you, for instance, a very famous painting by Rembrandt called The Supper at Emmaus, dated 1648. This painting is in the Louvre. It was in the Louvre when Courbet painted his work, After Dinner at Ornans. What I want you to notice is a kind of similar disposition of the figures. There's a certain similarity to the figures. Who is playing Christ in Courbet's image? And we're looking compositionally here to try to see parallels. Who plays the part of Christ? The guy in the shadows. Is that this guy?
No. On the right.
So, maybe I'm not asking this the right way. Compositionally, we're seeing a work which seems in some ways to have been based on a knowledge of the Rembrandt, all right? With the table and the figures around the table. So, if you have a figure on the left, a figure on the right, and a figure at the back of the table, come over here and tell me who plays Christ in Courbet's painting. Courbet, yes. Did I not hear you? Okay. Courbet is playing the figure of Christ, and this is a a kind of idiom that we're going to see over and over again in French painting. The artist as the one who is excoriated, who is misunderstood, who is the sacrificed element. Despite the fact that the painting was purchased by the state, it was criticized in particular for its size and for the indefinite lighting and for the lack of any kind of ethical or moral storyline or narrative. Courbet followed up the dinner at Ornans with a work which made him not so much increasingly famous as infamous. This is a work called The Stonebreakers, exhibited at the Salon of 1851. 5 feet 3 inches in height by 8 feet 6 inches, meaning again, these figures are life size. Courbet's inspiration for this work was based on an actual experience that he had had while traveling in the countryside. We know that he went home quite often to Ornans, and he traveled by carriage typically. And he tells us that in one of these expeditions back home, and then perhaps returning to Paris, quote, "I stopped to consider 2 men breaking stones on the highway. It is rare to meet this most complete expression of poverty. So an idea for a picture came to me on the spot. I made an appointment with these men at my studio at Ornans for the next day, and since then I have been working on the picture." I want to comment about that quote, about his telling us about the inspiration, because we're calling this man a realist, but you realize what he did not do when he saw these 2 men working is jump out of the carriage, pull out all of his painting equipment, and start to paint right there on the spot, what's called en plein air, just out in the open. This is not really happening so much at this point of time historically in the history of painting. We tend to see it a great deal, particularly if you go down by the beach, for instance, or other places, you see people who are painting right out of doors. But remember, the equipment was cumbersome. Artists had to still grind many of their own pigments and mix them. You don't have paint in tubes yet, but it also shows a kind of mindset for Courbet, who in some ways was a very traditional artist. He got this idea, but then he needs to have the models come in and pose for him in the studio, and he needs to kind of compose the painting in the studio and to kind of have them be there and model and work on it for a long period of time. So we're going to see this, of course, change eventually over time in the 19th century. So we have here 2 nearly life-size figures, a younger man seemingly on the left, and then an older man on the right-hand side. They are anonymous to us, are they not? We don't see their faces. What is Courbet telling us through this anonymity?
Who they are is not important.
Well, that's a possibility. Who they are is not important because they represent all such workers in France who have back-breaking jobs. Yes. So who they are specifically is not as important as the fact that they represent all workers who get little compensation, and it is therefore reflective of the sad state of the poor, of the lower classes in France. Very much the attitude of a Republican realist. The large scale and the common subject matter of the work created, as you might imagine, strongly negative feelings on the part of the public, who thought of fine art, who thought of great painting as concerned with grand historical events, with important people represented in them, or biblical subjects or mythological subjects, again, with very important personages represented in them. Courbet described the older of the two figures as, quote, an old machine grown stiff with service and age. And in fact, a closer look at Courbet's figure style in the Stonebreakers does in fact indicate a kind of stiffness and awkwardness of stance that was very often caricatured, because the caricaturists and cartoonists love to make fun of the subject matter of Courbet's paintings. So Courbet's figures would be represented as if they were toys on wheels or stuffed dolls because they looked so awkward and strange within the painting. But of course, what Courbet is doing at this point in terms of the figure in French painting is he is specifically relegating the classical poses, right, that are taught in the traditions of the Academy to the dust heap, and saying, what I paint is the way people actually stand or walk or work. This awkwardness is an essential ingredient of realism. And just as his compositions were not organized according to traditional principles, his figures were not articulated according to time-honored poses and idealized contours. I want you to notice also that even though, it's very hard with our eyes in 2012 to say, I don't see how you could criticize this painting. This painting looks perfectly fine. It's very realistic. The details are well done. The texture has been emulated well. The proportion is fine. I mean, it's all based on a kind of Renaissance window on reality. There's nothing that seems to be compromised here in terms of being good painting. But I do want you to notice, as with David's painting, where we said, okay, he's taking a stand here in terms of our beginning to talk about a neoclassical, a modern movement. We need to begin to see in increments that Courbet is organizing space somewhat differently. And actually in the line of what David was doing, he's delimiting the space. Do you see that he's building the space up in the back of these men who are very close to the picture plane, which David would have approved of, and he's building the space up vertically. There's a very strong contrast between the black or dark shadows in the background and the foreground, but literally our eye works more vertically in terms of any sense of perspective than three-dimensionally. There's just a little bit of an horizon in the distance. If he had eliminated that, this painting would have looked so flat to us, so compressed to the front of the picture plane. So, again, this emphasis on the surface of the canvas is important to Courbet, and he does move us from the younger man, over to the older man in just that way. Questions? Yes?
What exactly were they breaking stones with?
So in France at this time, and even still today in Paris on many of the streets are actually stone. And even to put a surface layer on top of little stones or pebbles, you need to break them up. And they didn't have machinery that did it. Today we use gravel that's made by machinery. So they're breaking up the stones to lay them on the road. Excellent question. The death of Courbet's grandfather in 1848 may well have inspired him to paint this work, A Burial at Ornans. 1849, 1850. I show it to you here in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris because, again, I want you to see the size just in relation to a couple of people standing there. Because if I tell you it's 23 feet by 11 feet tall, it might pass you by. But this, you look at this and you go, damn, that's a big painting. A burial at Ornans shows a group of people gathered around an open grave. Are these aristocrats? Are they particularly important people as far as we can tell? No, they're not. What we're seeing here are a group of peasants and bourgeoisie. Remember that term bourgeoisie, the middle class. B-O-U-R-G-E-O-I-S-I-E, B-O-U-R-G-E-O-I-S-I-E, gathered together at a funeral. Courbet decided on what at the time was considered a huge canvas, eventually, as I said, 23 feet across. We have here all of the mourners, all of the officiants at the burial, which numbers about 40 people. So this is a large crowd that has come here for the burial. There appear to be family portraits of the Courbet family and friends who posed specifically for Courbet because, again, the painting was inspired, it would appear, by the death of a family member, and we believe of his grandfather. I have a few that will show you. We actually think he posthumously shows his grandfather as someone who is present all the way to the left-hand side of the painting. And then you'll notice from that end, with the grandfather serving as what I will call a framing device, because his face is coming in, his body language causes us to move into the painting from the left-hand side, we start to read some of the individual figures. And there is some degree of overlap, but we can kind of move up and down, back and forth to look at the different figures. Men carrying the coffin, the clergy, male family members and friends, and then to the right, a large group of women in mourning dress, in black or dark blue. We know that from some original sketches that Courbet had really never intended any specific focal point. He had done some sketches of individual people, and then he incorporated those sketches into the painting. But in general, the figures move across the canvas, and there is really only, well, we're sort of even more desperate than we were in the dinner at Ornans, or after dinner at Ornans, to find the focal point. Because I remind you, in an academic classical painting, the artist is completely manipulating you to show you where to look first, right? You remember the Oath of the Horatii, and then there are adjacent and ancillary elements that the artist moves our eye through, but always back to the primary focal point. So let me ask you here, what's the focal point of this painting? So you're drawn to the red of the two members. These are leaders of the town of Ornans, probably the mayor. They're very wonderful, very common-looking individual portraits, and you're drawn to the red. So should these two individuals, who probably have no relationship to the person being buried, be the focal point? So you're drawn to the red. Where else is someone else looking in terms of a focal point? Yes?
In the cross, the person holding the cross.
Okay, so you're looking up at the crucifix. And by the way, Courbet was anti-clerical, even though he'd been baptized a Catholic. He was anti-church. So another question would be, why does he have a crucifix in this painting? And all I need to do is remind you he's a realist. And then why does he have a crucifix in this painting, at this burial? Can't hear you. It's a funeral. It's a Catholic funeral, exactly. So it was present. It was there. He's not going to exclude it. It's part of the realistic detail. So, well, let me ask you something else. I think you're all afraid to say it. Does anyone like the hole as a focal point? The hole in the ground? Okay. Does anyone like the dog? You have a few more people. The rest of you are simply not sure. And that's okay as well. Because basically, there is, interestingly enough, in Courbet's painting, the same sort of frieze-like quality, very careful reading of the individual figures across the front of the picture plane that you get almost in a David painting. So, in fact, he's created this sort of S-shaped curve. Do you see that with the figures, the heads of the figures and the bodies? And this is continuous. And he literally is making all of the figures about the same height, close to the horizon line. For Courbet, this perhaps symbolizes the leveling power of death, or the democracy of the grave, that we are all equal in death. But it also means that this is an additive composition without a central focus or psychological emphasis. In other words, it's like reality. If I were just to walk around the room and start passing by each of you, I would capture in my eyes certain little vignettes that I'm looking at. But I'm not creating an entire organized composition while I'm doing this. I'm looking at bits and pieces, right? I could take all of this information that I got visually back with me and then create a painting of a classroom with students who are busy listening to a lecture and taking notes. But what I want you to understand is that for Courbet, the greater reality is just getting the overall sense of these individual elements and not reorganizing them into a kind of grand academic classical composition. So there doesn't have to be. A focal point can be very artificially created. And in a sense, if we go back to the Oath of the Horatii and think about how artificial it was, that the father was standing there with his sword and the brothers were swearing on their swords, that was very artificially, but of course brilliantly created by David. So this is, of course, a painting that simply could not be criticized enough for its lack of academic approach, viciously attacked for being basically a celebration of socialism, that if we're not equal in life, we're all equal in death. Such an ordinary event was totally inappropriate for a painting that wanted to be considered high art, or perhaps at the level of history. This is not the burial of Napoleon Bonaparte or some great king of France. This is some man in Ornon, and we're not even sure exactly who it is. And these rough-looking peasants looked somewhat politically inept, politically like outcasts, and the French public found it an absurd painting. In fact, the dog was a particular source of criticism. Who the hell let their dog come in right here in the middle of the painting, right when the deceased coffin is being brought in? And some people were saying, who is this? Who is this? So you tell me. Who is this? I was actually at a funeral yesterday, and very sad in my husband's family. And actually, there were 4 men who were there. Who are they when you go to a funeral? So do you dig the grave yourself? No, you have grave diggers, yes? You have professionals who help you to bury the deceased. And what I observed is they helped, and then they went into the background. They disappeared while the prayers were being said. at the gravesite. When the coffin was brought in, they were really not there until it needed to be placed into the ground. So that's the gravedigger. So there he is. He's so prominent. And people were incensed. What is he doing there? Well, he probably was a member of the family, and his occupation was a gravedigger, and so he's there. It looks like he took off his smock from digging the grave, and he's there now, and he's going to continue to help. I just wanted to show you one of the cartoons that was made based on Courbet's burial at Ornans. This, in fact, is a work which tries to caricature the entire painting, showing the figures in the painting to be nothing but ciphers or commas, and then two ridiculous-looking men with strange hats on, and a dog. All right, and that is the summary of Courbet's great work. Caricaturists had a very fine time with Courbet, making up all kinds of cartoons and jokes about him. It was said that if you wanted to pose for a portrait with Courbet, you had to come dressed as a peasant, and you had to bring a shovel. And that's the way you get your portrait painted. And that when he was painting the burial at Ornans, he actually consulted with undertakers in order to get all of the details correct. So we start to see the way that the public and the critics are going after him. A typical reaction of critics and the public is evidenced in one written comment by the critic Claude Vignon. And this is what he wrote about Courbet's burial at Ornans. And I want you to listen to it, because this kind of vitriol is something we're going to hear from the critics in the 19th century for Courbet, for Manet. And part of it is just a kind of ignorance about what is happening at the time, and a kind of sticking to the previous traditions, which do not seem to have been fulfilled or met in this new expression. So Vignon writes, "A great black canvas takes up much space." So he's already commenting on how big it is. "Sharply strikes the attention. It is entitled A Burial at Ornans, and incontestably has a strong effect. One has never seen and never could see anything so frightful and so eccentric. So this picture gains its author, Monsieur Courbet, at least a success of shock. One looks at it, one even examines it for a long time under all its appearances and in all its aspects, but no matter what the long suffering and benevolence of the spectator, the impression produced is the same on all. Each, from the most whimsical artist to the most simple bourgeoisie, cries out as he makes off from the painting, 'Good God, how ugly!' It is, in fact, abominably ugly. There is no perspective, no arrangement, no composition. All the rules of art are overthrown and despised." Courbet would rather enjoy all of the attention, even if negative. He was wealthy enough not to have to depend upon selling his paintings to the salon public. In fact, he had a number of patrons who bought his work, and when he sold his paintings, they sold for good prices. What we are seeing here is the inevitability of that idea of the academic classical painter, represented by this sort of skinny old nude man wearing a kind of classical soldier's helmet and using his artistic implements to go after the very crude-looking man on the left-hand side, who, by the way, is wearing sabots, S-A-B-O-T, which is what peasants wore in France. They're wooden shoes, basically. And so what we're seeing is idealism versus realism. And guess who created this lithograph? Our friend Honoré Daumier, who's setting up the conflict here. Courbet had planned to exhibit a second showing of his burial at Ornans at the Universal Exposition in Paris in 1855. This is one of a series of World's Fairs staged in France at intervals during the century. For this exposition, the conditions of a traditional salon had been modified. The exhibition of paintings and sculpture was made international for the first time with an international jury. And the French entries were meant to summarize the preeminence of France in the arts, so not even former medal winners could submit whatever they wanted for the Universal Exposition. Several of Courbet's entries were in fact accepted, but the Painter's Studio, another of his works, along with the burial at Ornans, which we just looked at, were rejected. I show you a photograph of one of the walls from the Universal Exposition in Paris in 1855, in which, for your information, there was a major retrospective of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, as well as a major retrospective of the works of Delacroix. Each of these artists had about 40 paintings put up at the Universal Exposition. But Courbet's most important works, as far as he was concerned, were rejected. And he wrote in a letter, "I am almost frantic. Terrible things have happened to me. They have just refused my burial and my last picture as well as a portrait. They declared it was necessary to arrest at all costs the progress of my tendencies in art, which are considered disastrous." Courbet decided that if they would not formally show his work in the Universal Exposition, that he would show them himself. And in basically what has been called a show of contempt for the taste, if you like, of the French government at the time. And remember, I told you he had money. He constructed his own pavilion at the entrance to the Universal Exposition, and he put up the paintings that he wanted to show. There were visitors at his show. He made no money from it, but again, it was meant to make a point. Delacroix was one of the visitors, and he called the burial at Ornans a masterpiece, one of the most remarkable works of our time. Delacroix was known to be notoriously open-minded, of course, and after all, he's a romantic. You can't trust him with his taste anyway. Within 2 years after his failure at the Universal Exposition, or one might say his success, Courbet began to find regular acceptance at the official salon. That may have been because after around 1855, he stopped painting those damnable sort of socialist works. And he began to devote himself almost exclusively to landscapes, portraits, and nudes. I show you two works from this period, The Covert of Roe Deer by a Stream, 1866, and The Stream at the Puy Noir, 1865, and that's very dark in reproduction. So I apologize for that. By 1857, his work had become less controversial, and in 1866, despite his spoken disdain for the ruler, Emperor Napoleon III, Courbet was nominated to receive the Legion of Honor. This is, of course, the highest award that any Frenchman could receive from the government. Characteristically, when he was told that he had been nominated and was to receive the Medal of the Legion of Honor, he said, "I don't want it." And he replied, quote, "When I'm dead, let it be said of me, he belonged to no school, no church, no institution, no academy, least of all to any regime except the regime of liberty." France had gone to war with Prussia in 1870. And in 1871, when Napoleon III was defeated by the Germans, Parisian revolutionaries banded together in what was called the Commune, capital Commune, and they began to take over Paris. This is after the defeat of the French army of Napoleon III. Courbet joined the Commune and was put in charge of the city's art museums, and in fact, we are told, actually successfully protected them from the looters, because this was a very wild period for Paris. He also declared that the Vendôme column, a monument to the glory of Napoleon Bonaparte and a symbol of French imperialism and a symbol of Emperor Napoleon III, should be torn down and perhaps re-erected in a less important place in the center of Paris. The column was ordered destroyed in May of 1871, and subsequently, when the Commune was crushed by the armies of the Third Republic and the Third Republic established, Courbet was found to be responsible for the destruction of a major public monument in Paris, because he was vociferously in favor of the destruction of this great monument, which was meant, of course, to imitate the great columns of Roman generals at Rome, and which had actually a statue of Napoleon Bonaparte on the top of it. So I show you on the left-hand side an engraving from the time that shows the column being pulled down, and the Vendôme column today, because Courbet was actually ordered to pay to rebuild it. He was also arrested, sentenced to 6 months in prison, and they ordered him to rebuild the monument, which would have cost in today's dollars about $1 million. This is 1871. He fled to Switzerland. He left France. He lived out his life in exile, dying in 1877, still owing massive amounts of money in restitution for his complicity in the destruction of this monument. And this is a cartoon about Courbet, not just knocking down the Vendôme column, but all the columns in Paris. Questions? He's not someone you'll soon forget, right?